Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subs and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you all so much, I really appreciate it. And if you would like to take a couple extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you all so much for all your support. Now guys, before we begin today's video, I do have a few quick announcements for you. Number one, I do have a Titanic video planned for you guys today and I hope you enjoyed the video. This was definitely a very interesting topic to research. And then as far as when I'm going to be continuing the Lusitania timeline series and when is the video on the Endurance going to come out, well, here's my plan. So I've got the Titanic video planned for you guys today. The next video will be the next episode, the Lusitania timeline series. And then after that, I think what I'm going to do with the Endurance is just make one long dedicated video just with the story of the Endurance and the Shackleton expedition. So that's my plan for that. And, okay, so now that that's out of the way, I do have another very cool announcement, or maybe I should say I have something very cool and interesting that I want to show you guys before we begin today's real video. Now, just in case you all missed my last mail time episode, one of the things that happened in that video is that two fans of my channel, their names are Logan and Caitlin, they sent me this unbelievable handmade and hand-painted White Star Line sign. And just the build quality and detail of this sign was so unbelievable that I had to mention it in my mail time episode. And believe it or not, they do have their own online store where you can go and purchase one of these signs yourself. And now, the reason I'm mentioning this again in this video, and you just heard that sign knock against my table, but the reason I'm mentioning this again is because they just sent me their newest design. They just made this unbelievable handmade and hand-painted custom canard line sign. And once again, just like the White Star Line sign, the level of detail in this sign and build quality is just unbelievable. I don't know if you can see it in the video, but they even have the whistle on the funnel for the canard line funnel. And I mean, like, this sign is just unbelievable. And just like the White Star Line sign, you can purchase this sign yourself. So hey, listen guys, thank you so much for sending me this sign. Both of these signs, they are just unbelievable. And if any of you out there would like to take a look at these signs and maybe purchase one for yourself, I will include a link to their online store in the description below. All right guys, well hey, with that out of the way, let's now begin today's official Titanic episode. For today's video, I want to try to answer a question about the sinking of the Titanic itself. This is a question that many who have studied the sinking of the Titanic have often wondered about. The question that I'm going to try to answer has to do with the Titanic's grand staircase. This iconic room is arguably the most recognizable room on board the Titanic. I mean, with the wood paneling and the beautiful glass dome overhead, I mean, honestly, no other room screams Titanic like this room in particular. Now, the question that I'm going to attempt to answer about this room is, did this room actually flood the way it was depicted in the James Cameron movie? In case you don't know, in the James Cameron film, the way that they have depicted the sinking of the grand staircase is that water slowly comes up down the corridor on A deck, reaches the base of the grand staircase, surrounds it, and then as the Titanic's boat deck goes underwater, once the part of the boat deck that houses the grand staircase went under, then the grand staircase dome implodes and tons of seawater begin to flood inside of the grand staircase. So, my question is, did this really happen, or was this something that was just made up for the sake of a Hollywood film? Now you're probably thinking, this couldn't be that difficult of a question to answer, right? All we have to do is go back and look at survivor testimony into the sinking of the Titanic, find somebody who was within the grand staircase at the time that it was flooding, and then based on their testimony, we can say if or if not the grand staircase actually flooded the way we see in the James Cameron film, right? Well, actually, it's not quite that simple. This is because there were no survivors who were within the grand staircase at the time it was flooding and lived to tell about it. This is mostly because that in order for somebody to have been at the right place at the right time to see the grand staircase flood, by the time that all of this stuff happened, there would have been no way for them to escape that room alive. Because in case you don't know, this is a model of the Titanic, and the grand staircase was in between the first and second funnel. And that big glass dome that you see in that video, well, it was housed within this rectangular structure right here. So that means in order to have the grand staircase dome implode like we see in the James Cameron film, the water would have had to come all the way up the Titanic's boat deck and cover this rectangular structure. So the ship would have been roughly in this position as the grand staircase dome imploded. So, as you can see, there is no way anybody could have been within the grand staircase when this event happened and lived to tell the tale. However, even though there is no testimony from anybody who was within the grand staircase as it was flooding to tell us what happened within it, there is the testimony of one person who may, just may, be able to shed some light on what happened to the grand staircase as it went underwater. This is because, even though he wasn't inside of the grand staircase, due to his position on the Titanic's deck as the ship was going down, what he experienced may help shed some light on what happened as the grand staircase went underwater. The person I am referring to is this man, Archibald Gracie. Archibald Gracie was a first-class passenger on board the RMS Titanic, and spent most of the night that the Titanic was sinking assisting the Titanic's officers with the evacuation of the ship. Now, Archibald Gracie would end up surviving the sinking of the Titanic, and based on his testimony and his location on the Titanic's deck as the final plunge began, his testimony may be the key to help answer the question of what happened to the Titanic's grand staircase during the Titanic's final moments. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Gracie's story, I'm going to give you the quick version real quick. According to the story, Gracie was working at the very front of the Titanic's deck during the final stages of the sinking, trying to help one of the Titanic's officers get one of the last two collapsible boats launched from the Titanic before the Titanic sank. And then, according to the story, Gracie said that a huge wave showed up and attempted to wash him overboard. So what Gracie did was he grabbed onto a railing on the Titanic's deck and then held onto this railing while he waited for this wave to recede. However, what Gracie didn't realize was that this particular railing that he was hanging onto was now on a submerged part of the Titanic's deck. So basically what happened was Gracie grabbed onto this railing, and then as the Titanic continued to sink, it was now dragging Gracie down with it. And then instead of letting go of this railing and swimming up to the surface, Gracie said that before he let go, he felt this huge suction pulling him down. And he said he was underwater for a huge amount of time. And then eventually this suction went away and he was able to swim up to the surface. Now, in recent years, it's been proposed by those among the Titanic community that this huge suction he felt was the grand staircase dome imploding and attempting to suck him within the ship. And I've also, I've heard this story myself, and I've also assumed it's fact. And I've also talked about this in several of my videos on my channel. However, I've never looked into it deeply. I've never went into it and tried to figure out exactly where Gracie was, what he was doing, which collapsible lifeboat he was doing, or he was working with, to try to see if this theory is plausible or not. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this video is I'm going to try to retrace Gracie's steps by his testimony and see if or if not that this suction he felt could have been the grand staircase dome imploding or not. Now guys, just remember, there is going to be a little bit of guesswork here. I'm going to mix in information that we know for certain about what the Titanic was doing at these particular time points, and then I'm also going to mix in Gracie's testimony to see if we can kind of put together the pieces of the puzzle and see if or if not Gracie was actually trying to prevent himself from being sucked into the grand staircase. Alright, so we're going to start off Gracie's timeline at 2:05 a.m. At this point in time, Gracie was on the port side of the Titanic's boat deck near the bridge, assisting Second Officer Charles Lightoller with the launching of collapsible lifeboat D. This was the very last lifeboat to be successfully launched from the Titanic by means of the ship's davits. Once this lifeboat was launched, Gracie then headed over to the Titanic's starboard side to see if he could assist First Officer William Murdoch with the prepping of collapsible lifeboat A. Once collapsible lifeboat D got successfully launched from the Titanic, there were only 2 lifeboats still on board the ship. However, the thing is, these lifeboats weren't located on the Titanic's boat deck. They were actually on the roof of the officers' quarters right beside the first funnel. You can just see them right here. So on the Titanic's starboard side, which is right here, this is lifeboat collapsible A. And then right here on the Titanic's port side, this is lifeboat collapsible B. So because these lifeboats weren't on the boat deck and they were on the roof of the officers' quarters, this made them extremely difficult for the Titanic's crew to prep these lifeboats and get them ready to be properly launched from the ship. So, once Gracie saw collapsible lifeboat D get launched, when he headed over to the starboard side of the Titanic to assist Murdoch, he was trying to assist Murdoch in finding a way to get collapsible lifeboat A down from the roof of the officers' quarters down to the boat deck, where it could be successfully launched by means of the Titanic's davits. Now, at the exact same time that Gracie headed over to the starboard side of the Titanic's boat deck, inside of the Titanic, the water was currently flooding B deck. It had yet to reach the A deck level. However, the water was coming up very fast. Now, the reason this is important is because in the James Cameron film, all of the shots you see of the grand staircase flooding, well, these all happen on the Titanic's A deck level, which means that even at this late stage in the sinking, the grand staircase, at least at the top part where we see it in the James Cameron film, is still dry. Now, this section of the staircase would not flood until the final stages of the sinking of the Titanic, which would start in a few minutes, which means that if anybody was in there at that point in time, they would see a massive wall of water beginning to surround the grand staircase, just like what we see in the James Cameron film. So, based on this information, we can summarize that, at least theoretically, the flooding of the A deck level of the grand staircase, as depicted in the James Cameron Titanic film, is pretty accurate. It's pretty accurate based on what we know, what the water was doing within the Titanic and how this room would eventually flood. So on that part, I'd say, yeah, that's probably how it happened. But what about the part of the James Cameron film that shows the grand staircase dome imploding? Did this really happen? Well, let's continue the story of Archibald Gracie to see if we can shed some light on this question. Now, it took a few minutes, but with the assistance of Gracie and other members of the Titanic's crew, First Officer William Murdoch was successful in getting collapsible lifeboat A down from the roof of the officers' quarters down to the regular boat deck. However, when they did this, they began to try to prep this lifeboat and launch it by means of the Titanic's davits, which means they tied this lifeboat to the davits. But you see, the problem with this was, even though on the starboard side of the Titanic's boat deck there isn't any water there yet, on the Titanic's port side, the Titanic's deck is basically already completely underwater. This is because the Titanic had a sharp list to port at this late stage in the sinking. And due to the fact that there wasn't any water on the Titanic's starboard side boat deck yet, this could have led all of the members of the Titanic's crew on the starboard side to think that they had more time to launch this lifeboat than what they really did. Now, while Gracie was working with Murdoch and all of the members of the Titanic's crew to try to get collapsible A onto the Titanic's davits, eventually they would have become aware of the water slowly but surely approaching them on the Titanic's starboard side boat deck. However, while they were working on this, Gracie said that all of a sudden, something unexpected happened. Gracie said that this huge wave showed up out of nowhere and washed him away from collapsible lifeboat A. Gracie said that when this wave showed up, he jumped with the wave, and then the wave carried him from the Titanic's boat deck up to the roof of the officers' quarters, somewhere in between the first and second funnel, where he found a railing and grabbed onto it in an attempt to keep himself from being washed overboard from the Titanic. Now, when this wave showed up, this caused Murdoch and all of the crew members working on collapsible A to desperately try to cut the ropes to free collapsible lifeboat A from the Titanic. Now, the big question here is, what generated this big wave that Gracie said that he experienced? Well, we have a theory about that. At roughly 2:15 a.m., the Titanic's very sharp list to port went away, and the Titanic returned to more or less an even keel. Now, when this happened, since the port side of the Titanic's boat deck was already underwater, when the ship returned to more or less an even keel, this put the starboard side of the Titanic's deck basically level with the port side underneath the surface. So, since there was no water on the Titanic's starboard side when this event happened, this sent a huge wave crashing over the starboard side of the Titanic's boat deck. This could be the very wave that Gracie experienced that pushed him up onto the roof of the officers' quarters as the Titanic's final plunge was beginning. Now, based on my research, Gracie never said for certain where exactly on the roof of the officers' quarters this wave carried him to. The only thing we know for certain is that this wave showed up, Gracie jumped with the wave, found a railing, grabbed onto it, and used this railing to keep from being washed off of the Titanic. Now, the reason I said earlier that this wave carried him somewhere between the first and second funnel is because if this wave carried him up to the roof of the officers' quarters around where collapsible lifeboat A was stored, well, you see, in this area there isn't a railing. However, if you move just after that to around where the grand staircase dome structure was, you see, all of this area right here, there was a guard railing right there where he could grab onto that and attempt to keep himself from being washed overboard. So logically, think of it like this. Let's say my hand is the water and this is the Titanic. As the Titanic was sinking and this wave was going up the Titanic's deck, if Gracie jumped with that wave, then as the Titanic went down and the wave carried him, it does make sense that he would come across a railing that surrounded the grand staircase structure in between the first and second funnel, and he would attempt to grab onto that railing in an attempt to keep himself from being washed off of the Titanic. Now, by the time that Gracie grabbed onto the railing on the roof of the officers' quarters, the Titanic would have been dropping like a rock. The first funnel would have fell around that time, and inside of the Titanic's grand staircase, water would have been rapidly flooding the A-deck level of the grand staircase. Now, the question remains, somewhere right around this time, this is when Gracie would have experienced that massive suction that tried to drag him down inside of the Titanic. So the question remains, was this suction generated by the grand staircase dome imploding like we see in the James Cameron film, or could it have been something else entirely? Well, unfortunately, we can't really say for certain. This is because we don't exactly know where on the roof of the officers' quarters Gracie was. The only thing we know for certain is that he was in between the first and second funnel. And based on Gracie's testimony, all he said was that he grabbed onto this railing to keep from being washed overboard. That part of the ship kept sinking, and then once he was beneath the surface and about to let go of this railing, as he was about to let go, he said he felt this huge suction pulling him down. And then he also said that this suction kind of had like a weird flow to it, and the way that I read it was it almost seemed like he was describing a whirlpool effect, which would match the grand staircase dome imploding. However, there could have also been another thing that caused this suction. When I was reading his testimony, I didn't see him reference the falling of the first funnel, and he would have been right around that area too. And if there was any space underneath the first funnel that had yet to flood, when the first funnel fell, if he was already underwater at the time that happened, that could explain why he didn't talk about it, then that could have also generated the suction that he felt. So it could have been either the piping underneath the first funnel that tried to suck him in, if that hadn't have flooded yet, and it could have also been the grand staircase dome imploding, and that could have sucked him in. You know, there's no way to know for certain. But yeah, so that's the story of Archibald Gracie. While it can't really answer the question of if the grand staircase dome imploded like we see in the James Cameron film for certain, it is the closest story that we can use to try to determine if or if not this event actually happened. Alright, so now that we've talked about Archibald Gracie's story, I want to share with all of you guys my own personal theory on if or if not the grand staircase dome actually imploded or not. And honestly guys, I think it did. This is mostly because as the water came crashing up the A-deck level of the grand staircase, the Titanic's boat deck was still in the process of going underwater. And honestly, I don't believe that the entire grand staircase room could have gotten completely flooded with water at the time that the grand staircase dome dipped beneath the surface. So, because of this, yes, I honestly do believe that the grand staircase dome imploded, and it really could have been that tried to pull in Archibald Gracie. As I said earlier, we just can't say for certain, but I honestly believe the grand staircase dome did implode. So, let me know what all of you guys think. Do all of you guys think that the grand staircase dome imploded? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Alright everybody, well hey, I hope you enjoyed this video. This was definitely an interesting video to think about, and it was very cool to go back and research Archibald Gracie's story and try to put together the pieces of the puzzle of Gracie. You know, when I was trying to research him, I was finding a lot of conflicting information, like this article said he was here, this article said he was here, and I had to go and turn to his direct testimony in order to get the complete picture into where Gracie was and what he was doing, and try to piece together the pieces of the puzzle if he experienced the flooding of the grand staircase dome or not. Anyway guys, as I said, let me know what you all think in the comments below. Be sure to leave a like, be sure to subscribe, and thank you all so much for tuning in. You all are awesome, and I will see you guys in the next one. Have a good evening, everybody. Special thanks to our captain level Patreon supporters, Dakota Charbonneau, Moosh, and Greg Gallick. Thank you all so much for all the support.